James Meager guest star in 1984 audio series as Mr. Charrington, the man that Lambert and Winston Smith visit to buy a diary. James Meager is playing that character in my 1984 audio series. He's a member of the National Party and our very own Rangitata MP. He's in the Justice Committee as a chairperson and a member of the Regulations Review. He was born in Timaru, now living in Ashburton, and he got a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Law. So James Meager used to be a lawyer, but now he works as an MP for Parliament in Ashburton. So we'll be doing an interview with James Meager. So how are you today, James Meager?
Good, Josh, thanks. Nice to be here.
So what 1984 is, it's a dystopian fiction written by George Orwell about the dangers of totalitarianism and socialism. And through his mind, he created or had envisioned during the Cold War a set of ideas on controlling citizens. For example, destroying thought, rewriting history in books, scaring citizens into submission, or forcing citizens to see through the point of view of one person, which is Big Brother. And that idea allows no room for debate. And that is a brief sum-up of the dangers of dictatorship. So, firstly, about the actual book. What did you think about 1984, and how do you think it relates to our country?
Well, it's been a while since I read it. I think I read it probably 6-7 years ago now. And I've read a bit of Orwell, and I really enjoyed the book. I think it's really well written. He's obviously a great author and a great writer, and it's just an interesting read, and it's quite a straightforward read. So if you're sort of a beginner or getting into reading, I think it's quite a good novel to get your teeth stuck into. Yeah. It's interesting because, I mean, you outlined it pretty well, really. It's all about the dangers of totalitarianism and control and what happens when you get a big state interfering in every single part of your life. And it's, for me, as someone who's sort of a small state guy, a pro personal responsibility, pro individual rights and freedoms, it's a really interesting book about what could go wrong right at the end of the scale. Yeah, I think it's great.
Are there any ideas that come from it, economic crisis, illiterate citizens, fear of being watched, or death, that you think are logical to happen?
I think if you take any ideology or any philosophy to its extremes, then you are going to get some of those outcomes. So you talk about one of them about death, or about the fear of total control. I think ultimately if you do have a sort of a totalitarian, all-powerful state that controls every single thing you do in your life, it by theory has the decision or the right to say whether you live or die. And actually we have some pretty modern liberal democracies which actually have that right already. We have the death penalty in quite a number of countries around the world and a number of states in the US. So I think there is some logic to thinking through the process of what happens when the state gets too far out of control. But obviously 1984 is an extreme version of all that, and it's kind of a warning of, it's almost a slippery slope warning of what could go wrong if you allow too much control or too much imposition of thought, or if you don't respect the fact that freedom of thought and freedom of expression are a pretty important part of our lives and what it is to be a human and have free agency. I think, I think I wouldn't go too far with it in terms of trying to predict what will happen, but it's certainly something that might happen.
Cool. Now, on the economic side of things, the houses are gross and small. People don't have enough to eat apart from Victory gin, pinkish grey stew, hunk of black bread, cube of cheese, milkless Victory coffee, and other stuff. I know National is wanting to completely turn our economic crisis on its heels. If we want to avoid 1984's economic platforms, we need to look back to how it first starts. And that's obviously, I guess, economic crisis. So Mayor Brown of Ashburton essentially says that in the last 2 years, our inflation rates have gone up 4% and will continue to rise. Do you think this is accurate, and why?
I think you run into problems with any central government politician trying to predict what inflation will do, what prices of goods will do. there's a concept out there, I'm not sure of the exact terminology, but it's essentially induced inflation. It's when you talk about the fact that you think prices are going to rise or inflation will go up, and people's behaviour will change to meet those expectations, so they will perhaps put prices up in advance of that. So I think Mayor Brown was probably just reflecting on what had happened over the past couple of years, and he was, I suspect, putting it in the context of some of the rates rises, pressures that the council are under, and that, you know, their own blowing costs of what it takes to get good projects done. I think, tying it back into 1984 and, you know, the economic systems underpinning that book, it's a little bit unclear as to what exactly the economics are in that novel. I think the overriding message is it wouldn't really matter if you were running a market capitalist system or a full-on communist system. As soon as you have totalitarianism and complete control of the state over what you can and can't do, at that point it doesn't really matter what your economic system is. It's whatever the state says it is. And so the lesson I will take from that is that if you don't want to live in a situation where you have, you know, poor housing and you live in squalor and you've got very limited choice about what you can eat and everything's rationed because the state has control over everything, then you've got to allow people the freedom to, well, not only choose their own destiny, but the freedom to be a little bit different too. Difference brings the risk of inequality, and when inequality goes too far, that creates instability, and that's a real risk that we have to be aware of. But actually, a certain amount of inequality will be inevitable in any system where you allow people to choose different pathways and have different options and different outcomes. What you probably don't see in books like 1984 is that underlying all of the sort of the common folk living situation will be the people in charge certainly won't be living off their rations of Victory gin or their 1 or 2 bits of cheese or chocolate or whatever it is they were getting a week. They will be living lives of relative luxury and comfort. And I think that was probably Orwell's commentary on probably some of the Soviet and some of the communist states at the time, where those up top who had all the say about how people should and shouldn't live their lives didn't necessarily live those lives themselves and ended up causing mass starvation and mass devastation like that. So I think that's probably where we're at with that. I don't want to comment too much on Mayor Brown's forecast for what he's doing in this council. I think he's got a pretty good council, and they've got a tough job trying to keep keep rates reasonable, but also making sure that people invest in the core infrastructure that they need.
Okay. Do you or National have any ideas that could bring prices and our inflation rate down?
Yeah, so there's 2 things that really affect prices and inflation. The first one is sort of the domain of the Reserve Bank, that's the official cash rate. And we've sort of changed the Reserve Bank's focus back from a dual mandate, so they were asked to look after maximum sustainable employment as well as keeping inflation between that 1 to 3% band target range. We've said actually the Reserve Bank's focus should be on monetary policy, on fiscal stability, and on getting inflation back between that band. And then the other side of the equation is what the government can do on the fiscal side of things. So a lot of inflation is driven by what government spends. And if government pumps more and more money into the economy without getting good returns from it, you are just going to get an increased flow of money and you're going to get prices increase. So part of what we can do is focus the Reserve Bank on inflation, but also as a government look very, very carefully at our spending, make sure that every time we take a dollar from the taxpayer, it's spent on the highest possible value. And so what you'll see at the moment Nicola Willis is doing is that she's going through all of the spending programs in government and trying to find those that are either wasteful or aren't producing the results that we want them to produce, or are actually just producing things that we might think are low priority. So you might see some programs that are going towards marketing campaigns or going towards consultants to write reports and feasibility studies, and that money might be better spent in teacher aids or in cochlear implants or in frontline policing, and places where we think we can get better value for money. And if you reduce the overall amount of money that the government's putting into the economy, that will also reduce the heat on inflation too. So they're probably the main things that the government can do from that fiscal side.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds pretty cool. By rewriting books, history and historical newspapers, the party and Big Brother dumbed down the population and forced them to see through the mind of one person. They also take out words like revolution, so in a few decades, no one will be able to think about those ideas. So on the literacy side, do you think literacy is important? And how would you improve literacy in our country?
Yeah, it's very important. And I think underlying that little passage is the idea that you need to have a wide variety and plurality of voices and options when it comes to literacy. You run into very difficult territories when the government start censoring and start saying what you can and can't read. And yet there'll always be examples of publications and things that probably it is in the public interest to restrict. There are obviously laws around what you can and can't publish in terms of, pornography and publications that are harmful to children. So there are pretty good reasons why governments might want to censor that. But one of the words in there was about censoring and eliminating words like revolution and dictating to people what they can and can't read in order to control them in the future. That's a very dangerous road for government to go down. So the first thing you've got to make sure is that you respect and protect people's rights to access information. So you've got freedom of expression and freedom of thought, but you also have the freedom to access other people's expression and other people's thoughts, so a variety of information. And we want to encourage a lot of different voices and a lot of different ideas and have that contest and that debate of ideas so that, you can have an argument about what's right and what's wrong, and at the end of the day, it might be that there are two reasonable arguments on both sides and we have to let the numbers count, so we put it to a democratic vote, and that's how we move forward. And underpinning all that is making sure that you've got good literacy rates in school, because it's you guys, it's the people who are in education now who are going to be the future writers. And if we don't have good core basic literacy and numeracy and communication skills skills in schools, as I'm talking about literacy and communication and I muff up all the sentences, but if you don't have that good base knowledge in schools, you're not going to get that flow through into a good variety of literature and novels and vlogs and blogs and podcasts. So you need to make sure you get the basics done well during primary school and during secondary school, but still give people the choice to, if they want to pursue an arts career, that's great. If they want to pursue an engineering career, or they want to go out and be an entrepreneur or run a farm, that people have those options.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. So our next part of 1984, socialist countries take away private ownership of businesses and land and force owners off their land or use rules that can control them. This is bad because you won't get a voice into what's good for your land. While everything doesn't have to be manipulation, the simple fact is increased power increases the chance of corrupting yourself. No one can have all power without becoming corrupted. That's what happened to Stalin and Hitler. So, the Agenda 2030 has 17 main goals. Protect poor countries against climate change, equally share food for everyone, using land for clean energy sources. And those are of the few goals that would require a lot of land for increased government ownership. So on, I guess just private ownership, where do you think the future of farming is going in light of the fact all councils nationwide have signed up to the United Nations Agenda 2030?
Yeah, I read that and I wasn't quite sure what that meant in terms of councils signing up to it, because obviously councils don't have sovereign law-making power in New Zealand over property rights and over what you can and can't do with your land. They've got constraints around consents and what you can build, and maybe a government or a future government might look at liberalising that and giving people more property rights and more say of what they can and can't do over their land. Look, if you look into this, the UN's work and what they're trying to achieve with some of those goals, you can agree or disagree with the goals and the outcomes. Some of them are aspirational, some of them people might think, well, that's never going to happen, or actually it's the wrong focus. What I think is important in this whole discussion is, what are the mechanisms that are being used to enforce them? And so you look at, well, what powers do global institutions and multinational corporations and countries themselves have? Well, ultimately, and this is sort of a more of a philosophical discussion around what's the actual standing of international law. Can you have a body of international law that if one country breaches it, what are the actual repercussions? Well, it's always just been state by state. You can voluntarily agree to cooperate or have a treaty, and if you breach that, you might have some sort of international arbitration. But ultimately, it's the power of the state to defend itself against another state. So my sort of thought in all this is, it might be good having all these goals, but how could something like the UN, or how could a group of people ever force a country or a state to do something? The only way a country could be forced to do something would be if the country itself, with the sovereign right to make its own laws, chose to do so. And in a liberal democracy, where you have free and open elections that flow back and forth every few years, every 3 years for us in New Zealand, if the Democratic majority think that this is a good direction the country can be taken in, then they have the right to shift the country in that direction for the time being. But if people think it's the wrong way to go, they can make that argument, and they can get up and they can run political parties, and they can run for office, and they can shift the country in another direction. And that's the sign of a good, well-functioning democracy. And for any law that can be made, or any law that's been made over the past 6 years, it can be unmade. The problem comes is when you've, and this ties right back into Orwell in 1984, when you have a state which is sort of a totalitarian state where there is no say for normal people or even the majority to change direction. If it's just a few people at the top making decisions and they are the iron-cast decisions, that's a situation we don't want to get into. So I think for as long as we have sovereign states and places like New Zealand have the right to determine within its own borders what its laws are, there's not that much to actually worry about. What you've got to worry about is making sure that within your own country you think that your government is heading in the right direction, and if it's not heading in the right direction, get up and participate, run for office, become an MP, set up a think tank or a lobby group or a community organisation, and try and advocate for the change in the direction that you think the country should head in.
So a Methven farmer, he quite respects you, and he says hi. His name is Carl Thomas. His statement on land is: many banks such as BNZ now require farm methane emissions and nitrogen levels to be provided when applying for agricultural lending. This is an additional cost to the farmer to pay for consultants to construct these reports. His view is an applicant should be judged on the ability to service any finance solely. The banks have no business appointing themselves as climate police. Since our banks are partly secured by the government, they are within their rights to ask for an explanation of this policy, or even request that the practice ceases. So my last question on his statement, why do banks have to police private land, and would you be able to look into stopping this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I know Carl, so I know him throughout the campaign. He was actually one of the candidates, and he's a top guy. There's a few things to unpick there. So if you come from these issues from the perspective that I take, which is a property rights respecting perspective, and you respect and want to underpin the value of free and voluntary contract, you would say something like, well, the banks, you enter into a contract with the bank can have its conditions, you can agree to them or not agree to them. And in an ideal world, if the bank were putting in conditions in place that you didn't like, such as what Carl obviously has an issue with, some of the requirements around monitoring and measuring methane emissions, then you'd be able to go and choose another bank that maybe didn't have that option or didn't have that requirement. And that would be a healthy, functioning, competitive market. He makes a good point that government does get involved in regulating banks quite a lot, and when you do regulate the financial sector quite heavily, you make it hard for competition and hard for new players to enter the market. So if this became the practice of all banks, you might say, well, the individual has no choice because they need to borrow money. They can't go to another bank to borrow that money, therefore they're bound by some conditions that they might not like, and that there's a case for government to step in and intervene. My preference would be make sure government has the settings right so that there's enough competition in the market in the first place, and that it's relatively straightforward for a good, well-regulated competitor to enter and offer something different, and offer an alternative. Because, you know, if there was enough people who didn't like those conditions, then there would be space in that market for a different bank to set up. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the case at the moment, and it probably is quite difficult to enter the market. So CAR might have a case for government intervening and putting some conditions what banks can and can't require of you. And look, it's something that you could look into, but at the end of the day, I would prefer to go down an approach where you leave it up to the voluntary interactions between customer and bank, and make sure that government has an environment where it's you can set up as much of those alternatives as possible. Because then, you know, if Carl ended up not wanting to agree with the conditions his bank wanted to impose, he'd be able to go somewhere else. At the moment, he can't go somewhere else easily, so I think he might have a reasonable case for government to look into what banks are and aren't requiring. But at the end of the day, I think the best way to go would be to leave it up as much as possible for...
Take a straight and strong